Good morning. It's Friday. We've made it through another week. Grab your coffee. We're going to dig in. Um, we are expanding our coverage beyond Medicaid this week because we heard feedback from people that there are lots of things going on, true. And many of them are important to people with disabilities, also true. And a lot of the changes that are happening, some of them are with Congress and some of them are with the administration. So we're going to take some time to try and go through what we know in this moment in time and talk about the various cuts that we're aware of that are happening administratively, as well as what Congress is doing to make cuts through a reconciliation process and kind of hope to tell you how some of these things are related to each other. The first thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to do a little celebration because this week was the first of two of four state budget hearings. And last week, we talked about the importance of state lawmakers hearing about how important Medicaid is to people, as an educational effort, but also to elevate, hey, this is something that is important to the state budget. These are things that could impact the state budget if Medicaid is cut. And lots of you attended the April 2nd hearing, and the April 4th hearing is actually going on right now. And we know that there are several people who have contacted us who have said that they are going to speak about a variety of things. So first of all, let's celebrate everybody who went to the first hearing in Kaukauna. I heard from a couple of folks that their Medicaid was one of the top things that was talked about at that hearing in a variety of ways. And I actually got a text that there were some people who, almost made lawmakers cry. So, that's your powerful stories. Whenever you get tears out of lawmakers, you're making an impact. And there were certainly some very powerful stories that were shared about what Medicaid would mean and what less help from Medicaid would mean, that I think were definitely made an impact on the room. April, which is, we're now in April, is Medicaid Awareness Month. So that's a great thing for us to remember as we continue to look for opportunities to kind of talk about how all of these issues are impactful to people with disabilities and other groups who rely on these programs. The other thing that happened this week, Senator Cory Booker broke a record. He decided to use an opportunity to speak for as long as possible on the Senate floor. It technically wasn't a filibuster, but many people are describing it that way. He spoke for more than 25 hours straight, and about a lot of the many changes that are happening and the impact that impacts he's worried about for real people. But I think it's important that he read into the record lots of letters from people across the country, including people from Wisconsin, that were about Medicaid and Social Security. And our Senator Baldwin, was helpful, like asked some questions so he could keep talking. And a lot of the questions she was asking were about Medicaid, because that is something she's hearing a lot about. In fact, I was on a national meeting on Wednesday, and Senator Baldwin's name came up, and they said that she's reporting 80% of her calls on Tuesday were people who were thanking her for all of her questions about Medicaid to Senator Booker. So just, a small bright light of, that speech is not necessarily going to change the course of the reconciliation process or the decisions that, the majority party may be making, but it is very important to, as a statement, that they're staking out, these are the things that they're hearing about from ordinary people, and that can only help us. So I'm going to take a little step back and indulge me for a couple of slides about Civics 101, because I think that there's a lot of things going on and a lot of change happening, and it's sometimes hard to know who actually is supposed to be deciding what. And what authority do they have to do that. So when we're talking about all of these different federal programs, who gets to make decisions about them and what decisions do they get to make? It's a little graphic from the government about the three branches of government. Some of you who are old enough to remember Schoolhouse Rocks, there was that old song, How a Bill Becomes a Law, and you know, go through and all the branches. This is not going to, I'm not going to sing, so it's not going to be as fun, but basics. We have three separate branches of government at the federal level. We mirror this at the state as well, right? We have a state legislature, we have a governor who's the executive branch, and we have a court system as well. So every state kind of has this model as well. But at the federal government, we have the legislative branch, which is Congress. And Congress is both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate combined. So those two bodies that have to agree to pass laws and make spending decisions are Congress and the legislative branch. And they really have those two roles. They are the revisers of statute, right? They can decide to create or change or eliminate laws, right? And they have a big role in deciding how to spend money. So when we've been talking about all federal programs and funding, Congress is the body under the Constitution that gets to decide how do we spend the money that comes into the government and transform that tax money into programs and services that citizens and people use. And they have kind of this elaborate budget process where they make decisions. Do they create a program or eliminate a program or fund a program more or less? Very similar to the state budget process that we have going on now, which is just for Wisconsin. A big difference is the federal government can decide that it can spend more money than it has coming in. That's a deficit, which is a word you may have heard. And that's what it means, is that when you have a deficit, you have spent more than you have income coming in. Most of us can't do that in our personal lives, except that we do whenever we take out a loan or we have some sort of credit card debt. That's deficit spending and we pay it off, right? States can't do that. They have to balance their budget, so they cannot spend more than they take in. So that's the legislative branch. Big role, creating laws, revising laws, figuring out how to spend the money. That's what they do. The executive branch, which is the president, is supposed to follow Congress's laws. You know, the president does have veto power. So if Congress wants to change something and the president says, well, I don't think that should be changed, they can veto that law. Congress has the ability to try and override that veto. So there's a check on that power. But the president's supposed to follow the laws that are in existence. The president runs federal agencies, and we'll talk about, you know, there's a lot of different federal agencies, and they kind of implement all of the programs that Congress has decided should exist and has funded. So the president's job is to run the federal agencies within the law and the appropriations, that's the money, that Congress has set. The president does have the ability to set policy direction. So they can't do things, they're not supposed to be able to do things that are beyond what the law says they can. And they're supposed to do everything that the law says they have to do. But there is quite a bit of leeway to decide what is more or less of a priority. And they can set a direction to kind of emphasize certain things that they want to do then that might be different than, what the previous person wanted to do, for example. The president also has the ability to appoint. That means they get to pick the person who does a lot of different jobs in federal agency, and they're mostly leadership positions, because the leadership positions are the ones who are making direction, like they're setting the policy directions. Some of those appointments have to be approved by the U.S. Senate. Many do not. I think there's about 5,000 appointed positions that the president makes, and a handful of them are positions that are important enough that the U.S. Senate says we need to confirm that that person should be in that position. And you may have seen over the past few weeks that there have been a lot of confirmation hearings for different people. That's what that is. Those are the people that the president has said, I want, for example, RFK Jr. to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, or Mahatma Oz to be the leader for the Centers for Medicaid and Medicaid Services. We've talked about both those people in previous webinars. Those are appointed positions, and they were confirmed by Mr. Oz was confirmed today by the Senate as being okay to do those jobs. So that's the executive branch. And the third branch of government is the judicial branch. Courts, we hear a lot about the Supreme Court, but there's actually a large federal court system, and the Supreme Court is kind of at the top of it. The court's job is to interpret what laws mean. And usually it means that somebody is bringing somebody, meaning an attorney, who may be suing on behalf of it, or perhaps on organizations or other folks who have an interest in clarifying what the law means. They are bringing cases to the courts so that the courts can decide and interpret, what does a law mean or not mean? Like, is this legal or not? And that's what the courts are doing, is when they get cases, and there are quite a few cases at the moment that are being brought against the executive branch, they're ruling on whether what has been done was lawful or illegal, or if somebody overstepped what the law allows them to do, those kinds of questions. All right, so one of the main things that Congress does is try and figure out how to spend the money that taxpayers, which is all of us, send to them. So one of their major functions, the federal government collects revenue, and we all pay into that revenue because we're taxpayers. So they collect revenue, and then their role is to decide how to spend the revenue that the government receives. That's through the budget process. So all of those programs, all of those things that they have in the statute that require funding, okay, they've decided, oh, we have so much dollars, how are we going to spend those dollars? And then once those dollars have been allocated or appropriated, then the federal agencies are supposed to take those dollars and administer the programs that provide service or value to the people who paid the taxes, which is all of us. And sometimes there are programs or services, think about like in the defense or national intelligence or other things that maybe don't directly impact individual taxpayers, but are overall of interest to the entire country. Those are things that are funded by the revenue that comes into the government as well. A lot of the money that Congress appropriates that goes to federal agencies actually comes back to states and directly impacts the taxpayers who paid the money in. Medicaid is a good example of that. We've talked about Medicaid a lot. You know, all of the Medicaid money that the federal government has, they are paying back states a good portion of that money to help states run their Medicaid programs. There are also many examples of federal programs where they call them grant awards, where the agency gets the money and then they become the administrator, and their job is to give that money to states. And sometimes there are certain programs where the statutes are saying every state should get so much money and here's how it should be spent. Sometimes the federal government may get a lump of money and then like states become competitive grant applicants so they can compete to get some of that money. But an awful lot of things that people rely on in this state are actually funded by that mechanism, where federal funding is coming in to either help out money that the state's already putting in, like Medicaid or the Division of Vocational Rehab, or that the money is coming and going to states, sometimes to agencies like the one I work for, or counties, or other nonprofit organizations to run programs. Things like Meals on Wheels is an example where there's a big federal funding component, and the federal government isn't running those programs, but the local nonprofits that are, and the money that they're using to do that work is coming from the federal government, which is being awarded to the state, which is being awarded to the nonprofit. I'm going to linger on this slide a little bit. So, up to this point, we have been exclusively focusing on Medicaid, and it's because Medicaid is such a critically important program for many people with disabilities, especially those who need services that you can't get really anywhere else. And that includes long-term care, everything you know about family care, IRIS, CLTS, as well as nursing home care. We're going to broaden this out to, older adults and people with disabilities often have some of the same challenges and benefit from some of the same programs. So we've been really focused on Medicaid because it's so critical to people's daily lives. If your personal care attendant doesn't get up, that has an immediate impact. And it can have an immediate impact on your health and your safety and overall welfare. So it's really, really important. Medicaid is also the primary payer for mental health care. So for lots of people who have a primary diagnosis of mental health, this is a critically important program. But it isn't the only program that has a federal funding component that lots of people with disabilities use or rely on or participate in. When you look at this wheel on here, these are all programs that many people with disabilities, and oftentimes older adults too, really use. So Medicare is a health program that often pays for certain kinds of health care. It doesn't pay for everything Medicaid does. In fact, it pays for some things that Medicaid doesn't. Many people who are in Medicaid are also in Medicare, and they're called dual eligibles. And Medicare is fully federally funded, right? So I think for people with intellectual developmental disabilities, about 30% are in both of these federal programs. I think it's about 40% of low-income older adults are in Medicare and Medicaid. Okay. Also, many people with disabilities and low-income older adults are in Social Security. A lot of times people have paid in, over the course of their working lives. So Social Security, the idea is that you are paying in as you're working and that you get some of what you paid in back at the end of your working career. And for many people with disabilities, they may be in Social Security for much longer because the rules are slightly different. Or they're in Social Security disability insurance. So this program really does serve both. It also serves survivors. So if you have, for example, if you're a young child and both of your parents die, there's a survivor's benefit. So Social Security is a important program for people with disabilities, and it is totally federally run. Like the state doesn't run that program. Now, when you look at some of these things on here, Medicaid is a program that not everybody can get into. You have to meet certain requirements. And one of the requirements is that you have to essentially be in poverty, right? You have to be poor. There are income limits that if you go over those income limits, you are no longer eligible for the program. You have to have a certain level of assets to make it in to the program. It is designed to serve people who are low income, poor. We call those kinds of programs means tests. Do you have the means to pay for these services yourself, or do you need help? So there are other examples of programs here that are also means tested. If you are eligible for Medicaid, very often you may be eligible for SNAP, which is food share in Wisconsin. That's extra money to help you buy food. If you are eligible for Medicaid, you are probably eligible for housing vouchers, which again are designed to be for people with certain, who fall under certain income thresholds. There are other programs on here where the eligibility part, or at least part or all of it, may be based on your disability status. So again, Medicaid disability status is one component of how you're eligible. Poverty is another one. Social Security, you may be eligible because of your disability. Vocational rehabilitation programs that many people use, you're eligible because of your disability status. Special education, that is true, etc. Public transit is on here because both low-income older adults and many people with disabilities are also non-drivers. So you can start to see that disability status and poverty requirements to be in certain programs mean that there is a group of people that probably is more likely to use maybe all of these programs or maybe some combination of them all. And that's important because little changes to one program may impact, kind of the person's whole ability to, have a stable life, and changes to several or many programs that are helping somebody be stable can really be very impactful. I did not anticipate before yesterday that I would have to talk about tariffs, but here we are. You may have seen some news about our country putting in kind of taxes on to countries that we have a trade deficit with, is how they came up with it. And I'm not going to go into tariffs except to say that we have an economy that really relies on trade from many different places. So many of the things that we buy or things that we make rely on products or parts coming in from other countries. And when you put in a tariff, you make those things cost more. And that means that those higher prices or those higher costs mean higher prices. The tariffs that went into place are very broad, which means they really impact almost everything that's coming into the country. And the reason I'm bringing them up here is because there are many people in these programs that require means testing that have a limited amount of budget, right? There about 40% of older adults in this country are relying on Social Security as really their primary source of livable income in their old age, but that's fixed income. Their income doesn't go up if prices go up. True of people who are relying on Medicaid as well. If you are in a position where your income and assets are limited, they stay limited. And when costs go up, that impacts you more. So some lawmakers have been labeling tariffs a tax. Not quite a tax, but they do mean that everything that comes into this country is probably going to cost more, and it may cost a lot more, and those costs may go up for many, many things. So for people who are low income and rely on Medicaid, or whose job may be affected by a tariff, if you have a job where the company says, I don't think I want to expand right now because I'm uncertain, or the costs have gone up and I need to cut back on staff because I don't think I will be able to sell as much because the prices are higher. Or if you are a person who has just lost their job and costs are higher, these things really matter. And of course, if your income is low, or if you are losing income because you've lost a job, you are more likely to be in a position where you might qualify for Medicaid, right? That is kind of a larger context that was not true a week ago, but it is true now. And I'm saying it because many of the people in our lives are touched by many of these federal programs already, and increased costs for them will impact folks who already don't have a lot of income. Moving along, we talked about all of the different places that, all the different programs that the federal government sends money to. Here are some of the federal departments that house programs that are important to people with disabilities. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, that's where Medicaid is parked. That's where a lot of disability programs are. That's where things like the Federal Drug Administration and the National Institutes of Health and the CDC are, and some of those programs have touch on people with disabilities because they may be conducting research that's important to certain kinds of rare diseases, or things like epilepsy, or how to manage, or new treatments, or new drugs. Social Security Administration, all they do is make sure that those benefit checks go out on time to the right people for the right amount. They also do disability determinants. So if you acquire a disability, or you are a young person who's becoming an adult and need to go through the process of having a disability determinant before you can kind of apply for different benefits, that's the place to go. Department of Education has a big role, especially with students with disabilities. They send a lot of money to states specifically to help them with education for students with disabilities, as well as do civil rights enforcement. So when things really go wrong, that's kind of your last stop to say, hey, my school isn't doing what I need it to, and I'm not able to get the free and appropriate public education that is my right under federal law, IDEA. It's also where the vocational rehabilitation programs are housed. It's in the Department of Ed. Department of Agriculture, why is this on here? Well, that's the department that food share and actually the school lunch and breakfast programs are. Department of Housing and Urban Development, that's where housing vouchers are, if you are a person that is interested in those. The Department of Transportation provides a ton of money to states and support for public transit. Department of Labor and Justice both have a role in either in encouraging employment policy for people with disabilities, and in the Department of Justice's case, that's where civil rights enforcement is for things like the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disability Act and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So a lot of these places have a footprint in the lives of people with disabilities, and some of it, sometimes it's not as obvious, but they are all, agencies within the executive branch, and some of them have undergone a number of changes that we'll talk about later. So when we think about the revenue side of how much money does the government get in, mostly what I want you to see here is we individuals are the primary source of revenue for the federal government. And you can see that payroll taxes, so things that employers pay, are another big source of revenue. And that's really where a lot of the Social Security revenue is. At the moment, the amount of revenue that the government takes in is not the amount that they spend, okay? That's that deficit piece that we talked about. The federal government is not collecting as much revenue as it wants to spend. And so we have debt. And you can see that we pay, that part of what we're paying is debt. The reason I bring that up is the conversation that has been had in Congress has been exclusively about cuts. It's what can we do to really cut a lot of money so we don't spend so much. And they've been saying that one of the reasons they want to do that is to reduce the deficit. And I think that it's important for folks to know that the Congress really does have multiple options here. When you look at the revenue picture, you could say, okay, maybe what we do is increase revenue and not make cuts. Maybe that's one option. Maybe we could increase some revenue and make some cuts. That's another option. But the option that Congress has been talking about exclusively is we are only going to make cuts. And the cuts that they are going to make are to extend a tax break, which is essentially holding down the amount of revenue that the government is taking in. I think we've been kind of conditioned to think about tax cuts as being inherently a good thing. And people may have different opinions about that. But I do think it's worth thinking about whether or not that is necessarily true. Tax cuts limit the amount of revenue. So you have less money to spend if you collect less money, okay? We could be having a very different conversation. We could let these tax cuts expire. And then we wouldn't be talking about cutting $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years out of the federal budget. We could go back to paying what we did in 2017. And if we did that, you would have more money to do things like pay down the debt, to keep programs that are being cut the same or change them. And maybe you don't let everything expire, right? Like there's some options that aren't, either on or off. We could pay a little more, maybe not as much as 2017. Or some people who pay those taxes could pay a little more, but maybe not everybody. So there's a lot of room in this conversation for finding ways to make more revenue instead of just saying our primary goal is to keep the tax cuts that we made in 2017 the same, and then solve the issue by cutting programs like Medicaid. There is a little tax calculator out there. So in, your spare time, if you wanted, this is not a precise tool. It's designed to be kind of a blueprint for people, but it has a number of scenarios that you can click in, or you can do your own. Like if you know how much your income is and a couple other factors, you could click the create a custom scenario bill and figure out, what would it mean if your taxes went back to 2017 levels. Now for a couple of the lower income folks here, like looking at the example for James, who has no kids, and he makes $30,000, and the retired couple that makes $48,000, the value of keeping the tax cuts as they are, as not going back to 2017 levels, is a few $100s. I don't want to minimize that, because if you are a lower income person, and there are many people who make less than 30,000 or 48,000 a year, those dollars have a lot, they matter, because if you're lower income overall, you have lower buying power. But still, there's a range here from a few $100s, and then different scenarios, it might be a couple thousand or more, depending on your scenario. The actual change in take-home pay ranges from a 0.75 increase for some people to about 4.45%. Okay. Now, most of us, if we only looked at, okay, how much more would I pay if these tax cuts went away? We would go, well, I'd rather not pay that, because no one likes paying taxes. But people do expect the government to do things. Remember, that's what Congress does, is they collect all this revenue and then decide how to spend it into programs or services that people need or that they want. And so if you look at what this tax, what it would mean for you financially if you went back to the 2017 levels, it's also important to think about, well, if I get several $100s or $1,000 back at the end of the year, am I losing programs or services that are worth more to me than that? And if that's the case, then maybe your calculation changes in terms of how much those tax cuts are really worth for you. Here's another way to look at it. This is an analysis that just came out, and it was based on what the House budget resolution kind of telegraphed as to where they would expect more cuts to come from. And it is Medicaid and SNAP that are two of the places that committees that oversee those programs were assigned more cuts. In fact, we've had a number of webinars where we've said, yes, this $880 billion number that was assigned to the Energy and Commerce Committee does mean Medicaid. So this analysis says, okay, what's the value of those tax cuts when you subtract out what people might lose in terms of help from Medicaid and help from SNAP? And for a good portion of people, good portion of taxpayers who are the lowest income people, the amount that they lose from potential cuts to Medicaid and SNAP is greater than what they get back, in terms of value for the tax cuts. The Congress is letting some things expire that will increase costs for individuals. So the entire conversation about reconciliation has been about how to extend the 2017 tax cuts. There's been no discussion of whether or how to extend the funding that is currently keeping the ACA marketplace plans low. That expires at the end of 2025. So Congress is willing to let some things expire. And some of those things will actually have a big impact and increase costs to individuals. So if you are a person who works for a small business that's small enough to not provide employer sponsored insurance, or you have your own business, or you are a retired person who's no longer on employer insurance and you're not quite in Medicare, like a lot of people are, more and more people are getting their health coverage and insurance through ACA marketplace plans. And right now, the federal government has been providing a little bit of money to keep the cost of the premiums for those plans that you pay every month low. For a lot of people, the value of keeping the monthly premiums low, again, may outweigh what they might get back if the tax cuts are extended. And there's actually a map. Some of you have seen this before. Kaiser Health Foundation did do an analysis of what's the value of, that might go away at the end of 2025. What would it mean if those things expired? How much more would people's premiums be? And they did it by congressional district. And you can see they kind of break out a 40-year-old who's, low income, and a 6-year-old couple who's maybe a little bit above, well above medium income. And what you can see is, especially for the 60-year-old couple, depending on where they live, the amount of premiums that they would pay in premiums goes up a lot, like a real lot. And there's a little asterisk at the bottom here. If you go back to the tax calculator, well, if you're the 40-year-old making $31,000, it calculates you'd say you get you'd save $362 a year. That is less than $1,140 a year. So that's a calculation, right? The older couple, especially because insurance costs tend to go up as you age, they really do not come out ahead in terms of the increased costs in premiums far outweighs the amount of tax, what the value of extending those tax cuts is. And those are just two ways to look at it. Certainly with now the tariffs on top, where costs may also rise, you can see that for a lot of individual families, the value of the tax cut may start to get eaten away pretty fast as other costs rise. And there's 267,000 people in Wisconsin who are in ACA marketplace plans. Sure, could they choose a different plan that might be lower? Maybe, but if you're paying costs that are, $22,000 a year for your health insurance, maybe you can get away with a lower plan and it would provide the coverage you need. Maybe you take a risk and get a lower plan or go uninsured, and you end up with really big medical bills that you can't pay because it doesn't cover what you need, or you don't have coverage at all. This is a really long way of saying that Congress is making a lot of choices, and those choices are related and they cost individuals. So, when you're thinking about, are these tax cut extensions really worth it? Is it worth cutting programs like Medicaid, programs like SNAP? Should we pay more to keep those programs the same? And why aren't we talking about that as an option? I think it's a useful exercise to go through. And there are definitely some cuts that Congress is considering that will be felt immediately by people. Medicaid is one of them. For folks who really need that for healthcare or long-term care, those needs are always there. They don't stop just because there are fewer dollars. And certainly in a climate where you have higher costs and people who may be losing jobs, one of the things we've talked about with Medicaid is that it is able to expand when things go wrong. So in periods of high unemployment, there tend to be more people who are in Medicaid because they've lost a lot of income, right? And they've lost jobs that might have had insurance. in times like the pandemic that we had, in 2020, lots more people came on Medicaid. Again, they lost their jobs, right? So it is a place where when things go kind of wonky in the economy for whatever reason, you tend to get more people who rely on programs, the very programs that Congress is thinking about cutting, because their individual economic situations have changed. Some of the cuts that Congress and the administration are making also have long-term effects. If you lose progress on new drugs, if research stops, that means you don't get better treatments. If you have reduced capacity to operate programs, so people have a harder time accessing benefits or making changes or getting through, and everything becomes harder. These are all effects that from cuts that result in less service for people. So now we're going to transition. We're going to talk about Congress first. There's been some movement on the budget reconciliation process. Budget reconciliation, again, that's where those Medicaid cuts are. And remember, the House has already passed a budget resolution. This week, the Senate is passing a budget resolution that is different than the House. So we're going to go through what that is and kind of what we think is going to happen in the coming weeks. Here's our little flow chart. The new change here, and we'll talk about this in the next few slides, is that the Senate introduced a budget resolution. We know it cleared the first procedural hurdle, and today is on Friday, April 4th. They are doing their debate and their talk about amendments, which is called a vote-a-rama, by the way. Kind of cool word. And they're anticipated that they're going to pass their version of the budget resolution tomorrow on Saturday. We'll talk about what's in it. It's really unclear if the House will end up supporting that resolution. What we also know is that when the Senate passes that resolution, it has set a deadline for itself of May 9th for the Senate committees to decide on cuts, and then for a different Senate committee to figure out the debt ceiling plan. So the basics is the Senate's introducing a budget resolution that sets a really low minimum for the amount of cuts each committee must make, but don't be fooled. That's a floor, not a ceiling. It keeps the House's $1.5 trillion floor for cuts, doesn't add the extra $500 million in cuts that the House has, and it adds in the debt ceiling extension. Remember, we talked about the debt ceiling. That is the point where the federal government can't pay its bills on what it owes. We've been spending more than we have, so we have a debt ceiling that is that point where you don't want to default on the money that you owe. And this resolution includes some language that would fix that, okay? So the Senate version of the budget resolution has different numbers than the House. It has lower numbers of minimum cuts that the committees must make. That doesn't mean less cuts, okay? It means those low amounts are the floor for what must be cut. And there's no ceiling to how much the committees can cut. That's a strategy, and it's a strategy to hide how much they will cut and where until the legislative language is released. This strategy is all about setting the minimum as low as a few billion, and then, quote, with the understanding that they would then go substantially higher in the actual reconciliation bill itself. The other thing the Senate is doing, without permission of the Senate parliamentarian, by the way, which could be an interesting wrinkle later on, they're using a little bit of magic math. And they're using an accounting tactic to make it look like extending the 2017 tax cuts. Remember that $4.5 trillion of revenue that won't come in if we extend the tax cuts? they're making it appear to cost nothing. And it's kind of it's an accounting technique, right? So it's unclear if that will be acceptable, but that's what they're doing. And they still have a goal of cutting 1.5 trillion in cuts. There are some senators that want to go to cut much more than the 2 trillion the House wants to cut. In fact, one of our senators, Senator Johnson, is quoted as being one of those senators who would like to see deeper cuts. And some people are saying they want to go as high as $6.5 trillion in cuts. So I say that just so that people understand there is quite a bit of division, even within the U.S. Republican Senate caucus, about how deep they want to make cuts and where. Once the Senate and the U.S. House have both passed a budget resolution, and the House has to agree to what the Senate does, or they have to negotiate on something different, then the budget reconciliation process begins. So we've kind of been in this hover period for a period of weeks. Remember, this was supposed to be all done in late February, and we're now in the beginning part of April, and we haven't even started. That is all about all of the advocates who have said, wait a minute, this doesn't seem like a well thought out idea. And what do you mean you're going to make cuts to Medicaid? You have been the reason why this process has not gone down the merry path already. And you are also the reason why there is a lot of hesitancy and disagreement right now. As soon as the reconciliation process begins, then Congress starts writing legislation to make cuts. Probably definitely to federal Medicaid spending, but other programs important to people with disabilities as well. Yeah, they have to spend the same language. Different language in each of these budget resolutions kind of gives each chamber some leverage over the other. So the chamber can propose different cuts and then they merge their plans together. So we could be in a situation where maybe the House and Senate agree on some things, which if they agree on some things, it makes it more likely they may do them. But they also can have their own individual ideas, and some of those might get accepted or changed or combined together, and you could end up with a package of things that includes a lot of different cuts. The Senate and the House have real disagreement, not only about the approach each one is using. They have some trust issues as well, and a lot of disagreement. So the House has a number of very strong fiscal conservatives who really are thinking about reducing the deficit. They want in writing, we want a high number to achieve to make cuts, and we want there to be consequences if we don't get to that number that we have set aside. So again, they want to make 4.5 trillion in cuts, and they've put it in writing. And if they want to extend the tax cuts, they want to make sure that the 2 trillion in spending cuts that they want happens. And if they make less spending cuts than 2 trillion, then they can't do as much as tax cuts. So they are sending a very strong, serious message of here's what we want to do. And they have assigned big numbers to committees that really do give a strong impression of where they want to make cuts. The Senate plan is different in the sense that they don't want to telegraph how much cuts they want to make or where, right? And in fact, they're trying to say that the tax cuts that they want to extend won't cost anything to extend using a creative accounting technique. That really bothers some of the folks in the House. They don't think that that is a good idea or a good approach. They don't want low cut. The House may not want low cut levels, and they don't trust that the Senate will agree to bigger cuts later. The House does also, it really would prefer the Senate to lock cuts into the budget plan now, so they have to do them, much like their plan does. And number of them are kind of grumbling because they are really worried that by saying the tax cuts don't cost anything because of creative accounting, that they're actually just going to add to the debt without really working to resolve that debt. The Senate, on the other hand, there's a lot of divide within their conference. They also, some of them don't like the approach of treating the tax cuts like they cost nothing. Some are worried about how much cuts to Medicaid the House plan might do, and they are not real supportive of Medicaid cuts. And there are others who are like, why are we putting the debt ceiling in this? So there's a lot of disagreement here about approach. That's okay. Disagreement is the wedge that causes delay. Delay is the opportunity for people like us to ask questions and encourage those doubts. Doubts create more delay, and delay means there's more time to stop cuts or ask different questions, like maybe there's a revenue solution here as well. Once reconciliation starts moving, and I think it is a question of when, the Senate has been the slower body here and has not moved as quickly. Now we're seeing that they have a plan, that they're going to vote on it tomorrow. The House Speaker is saying, well, we'll do something next week to get the plan. I think we're at the point where if something doesn't stop those two processes, we will be in the process where reconciliation is moving forward. And they have an incentive to move fast because it makes it harder for people to know what's in the bill and what it means. So be prepared. There's plenty of time. There's plenty of time to avoid cuts, but we're entering a different phase in the process now. Just so people are aware, because the House has been clear about what its budget reconciliation will do, I'm going back to a February article that had some nice graphs that I liked that kind of shows you what the House plan would do, okay? So the biggest part of where they want their cuts to come from is Medicaid. We've gone through this a number of times in previous webinars. Medicaid, the committee that is oversees Medicaid is assigned the largest amount of cuts, and the Congressional Budget Office has analyzed and said, yes, there absolutely have to be big cuts to Medicaid because there isn't enough other stuff in that committee, and you've promised not to touch Medicare, okay? And we know that if federal Medicaid spending goes down, then that means that states get less money and state budget holes will be created, and then states get to be the ones who make the decisions on how to cut the Medicaid programs that they're operating. So we've kind of been through that piece, but it's important to remember what the House budget resolution does and where it puts cuts is a good bulk of them are coming from Medicaid. It's not the only place though. The Department of Education and Workforce Committee has $330 billion of cuts that are required. And you can see that that's roughly half-ish. Maybe my math's a little off, but you can see, of the total amount that committee covers, 330 billion is quite a bit of it. There's been a lot of discussion about the budget reconciliation requiring some fairly large cuts to education. The Department of Public Instruction actually did some analysis. There's a link on the slide here. You can go to that website. They have an interactive map, so you can zoom down and click on different school districts, and you can get a fact sheet just like this one for every individual school district in the state. And you'll notice, this is the statewide one. You'll notice here's how much federal funding comes into public schools from both the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, almost $842 million. And they break it out. The Department of Education funding that comes into school districts is one amount. And then the agriculture piece is that school lunch and school breakfast program stuff. So you can look at your individual school district and see things like how much of the district's entire budget is actually supported by federal dollars. You know, what would, and start to think about what would that mean to your district if those funds were different than they are now. Agriculture. Most people believe that the majority of the $230 billion of cuts to this committee might come from the SNAP program. You can see that SNAP is kind of the biggest piece of what's in this committee, so that makes some sort of logic. And there are another almost 600 billion of other spending cuts that aren't assigned to any committee, which is kind of a green light that says, hey, you know, if you're a committee that we've assigned cuts, err on the deeper side of things, right? And then the House budget is kind of committed to trying to reduce the current debt that our national government has. So some of the money that they're cutting, they would assign to go to that. That's what we know about the House budget resolution. And we're analyzing that because the numbers are clear. Remember, the US Senate resolution, they're deliberately not telling you how much cuts and where. They're just assigning very low numbers to committees, which means the cuts that they come up with will be a little bit of a surprise at the end. Reconciliation isn't the only way to make budget cuts that Congress could do. So the US Senate is already considering other ways to cut the deficit. And I want you to know, again, they're looking to make spending cuts to reduce the deficit, not revenue increases. Okay. And there's certainly this week been some articles that are talking about, okay, beyond reconciliation, how do we make the cuts that the administration has been happening, which is what we'll talk about next, okay, right? How do we, you know, change the statute or change the federal spending to match what has already happened? That's called a rescissions package. And they may use the 2026 appropriations process to formalize some of the cuts that DOJ and the administration has been making since January 20th. So just to put that out there, we kind of have a we have this big reconciliation process, which could impact many programs in, you know, important to people with disabilities and reduce the amount of support for those. We also have an ongoing administrative approach where many programs are reducing or being cut, or people who are running those programs are having their positions cut. That's happening at the same time. And then you may have a couple other options for reducing spending that basically says all of the cuts the administration has already made are okay-ish, and then using the next budget process to cut deeper. So I realize that's a lot of things happening at the same time, but I do think all of those things are real, and they are all happening at the same time by design. All right, so what has the executive branch been doing? I'm going to cover really 3 departments. For many people, if you've been following the news, really since January, you may have seen reports of various federal agencies, kind of the Department of Government Efficiency, which is not a department, it is an external thing outside of government. Kind of private sector people are coming into these federal agencies, and a lot of them seem to be making decisions to essentially fire staff or stop payments, or you know, decide that agencies that have been established under statute and funded by Congress no longer exist or are no longer able to function in the same way. The administration and DOJ are moving very quickly to make lots of different changes. So DOJ has been kind of given the keys to the castle in many agencies. There are lots of places that have reported that these individuals who are private sector employees have now access and have had access to a lot of government records, many of which have statutes that may protect their disclosure. And that includes, your tax records, various payment systems that federal agencies administer, other databases. And there's some indication that that information is kind of being used through some AI to make some of these cuts and spending decisions. There have been a lot of reports across many agencies of staff being fired through mass layoffs. Some of that has direct impact on program function and customer service. And certainly there have been staff where all of the staff for a certain program has been fired, which means the program exists in statute, as does the funding, but there's no one to operate it, which is that is an unprecedented situation. There have been whole agencies that have kind of been dissolved, or programs that have stopped programs that Congress has authorized and funded. So the USAID is the first example. I think the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has some similar happenings. This is happening in many other agencies besides the ones that we're going to talk about. There have been movements to cancel leases and close offices. And there have been efforts to stop payments to states or grantees, or taking back money that was already appropriated. We just had in Wisconsin $213 million of money for mental health and drug addiction, things that were authorized under prior spending bills, where that money has been stopped and not come to the state. And there were definitely programs that were relying on that funding to pay staff that are now ceased. That's true across states. Wisconsin is not unique in that. I was on a national meeting yesterday where my friends from Kentucky said, yeah, we had 500 million that was clawed back, is the term. There's also been some changes to agency policies, or changes in emphasis on what the agency is choosing to prioritize, that will either make it harder for the public to get access to help or to service. A lot of these things that I've just talked about, many of these actions are believed to be illegal, and there are lots and lots of ongoing court cases about many aspects of what has been happening. So I can't keep track of all the court cases. There are too many. But you may have heard about, did these mass layoffs happen in a way that was compliant with, employment law? Or should these folks have had access to this information that's already out there now? And the courts are in the position of kind of evaluating every case on a case-by-case basis and making a ruling. And for the most part, they are saying, yes, these things that you are doing are not legal and should not have been done. But that ruling is being made well after it's already happened. And so, the remedy of how do you undo some of those things that may be undoable is really an open question. We have never been in this scenario before. So that's all I can say, is that, things are happening that the courts are later saying should not have happened, but they've already happened. And some of them can't be undone. A lot of attention has been on the number of federal employees that have lost their jobs. There is a nice New York Times article that's trying to track all of the number of employees and where. And I think that there are a couple of things that are important to remember from the disability perspective in the state. When you have federal employees do things, if all of the people who have been fired are really not valuable, then we should expect no change in service, correct? But that is not what's bearing out right now. when you have fewer people to do the same amount or more work, there are fewer people to make sure that laws are being followed and enforce them when they aren't. There are fewer people to look for fraud, waste, and abuse, and certainly some of the places that have been targeted have been exactly the staffing that is, tasked with searching for fraud, waste, and abuse and addressing it. There are a lot of people with very specialized expertise to help states that aren't there anymore, fewer people to serve customer problems, fewer people to monitor program quality, fewer people to enforce civil rights. That is the reality of fewer staff positions. The other piece that is important is that many of these federal employees actually work all over the country. So there are many people in our communities and in Wisconsin who probably were federal government employees and may have lost their jobs and their income in this process. And there are a lot of federal employees that make sure money flows to states. And some of those people have lost their jobs, which makes it very uncertain for lots of state employees and state programs as to will the money that they rely on to pay their staff and do their work be timely and consistent and been done with the same expertise as the person who perhaps had been in the position to really make sure things happened that needed to happen, oftentimes for many years. So that's to say that a lot of these federal workforce cuts may actually have a local impact, and some of that impact has been immediate and some of it may be ongoing. Certainly the federal government also gives states a lot of money to do certain things, including grants, and there have been contracts and grants that have been stopped, which means that the people who were funded with that money don't have any funding for their paychecks anymore. Took a few of the agencies that were covered by that article, and you can see that, the education department has already had almost half their staff leave. There are lots of planned reductions of staff for Social Security. This article was updated as of April 1st. Health and Human Services has lost about 25% of its workforce, 20,000 people. HUD, lots of folks there that are still to go. Agriculture. So these are people who have already lost their jobs. We'll start with Health and Human Services. I just read an article this morning before we came on. This week, Tuesday, 20,000 workers across the agency were fired. 10,000 on April 1st alone. They also canceled $11.4 billion in grants to states. Wisconsin was impacted. I think we had $213 million that we thought was, thought was ours to spend. That a lot of the changes to especially the National Institutes for Health have impacted Wisconsin because we do have a lot of universities who are doing research work and other things that relied on that money to come in. The Administration for Community Living, surprisingly, was disbanded, and there is not a transition plan. About 50% of 40% or 50% of their staff is gone. And there are lots of other divisions here in the Department of Health Services that all had pretty big impacts, including CMS. I mean, CMS has lost some employees too. So we kind of don't know exactly who's gone and what they did, but we do know that there are holes. And this morning's article, the secretary was quoted as saying, well, about 20% of those people are people we shouldn't have let go. And that's all according to plan. We knew that we would fire a bunch of people and 80%, we were going to make some mistakes. So that's new this morning. that, out of that 10,000 people, apparently the Department of the secretary is now saying 20% of that 10,000 we shouldn't have fired and we'll bring them back. I'll focus a little bit on the Administration for Community Living. This is where a lot of the disability and aging programs are housed, and they're all together because aging and disability populations actually share a lot of the same challenges. And as people with disabilities age, they become part of the aging population. So there was an effort, in 2015 to kind of bring 2012 to bring all of those statutorily required groups under the same umbrella, with the idea that it would increase collaboration and be helpful. And I think that has borne out to be true. But it was a real surprise that the Administration for Community Living was part of, DOGE's ideas of what to cut, especially since Project 2025 actually recommended moving things to this agency. So it really does feel like the decision is not being made by necessarily the people in the department who have any amount of expertise in the actual programs that are being, changed. Senators have a lot of questions about this, and you can see that this is a long letter. You can read the whole thing yourself. But they actually specifically pulled out, why are you making changes to this Administration for Community Living? And you can see the questions that they're asking are pretty basic. Like, how many positions? What grants and contracts have you stopped? Like, are there things that you've stopped payment on that we have authorized? These are pretty important questions, and they're being asked after the fact, after these changes have been made. Next week, the Senate wants to hold a public hearing specifically on the changes at the Department of Health and Human Services. And this is a really important opportunity for advocacy and to get the Senate help members to ask questions. So that's a positive thing. Education, they began laying staff off the week of March 10th. 10 days later, an executive order came on that directed the closure of the Department of Education. So this department, we've kind of covered this before, has a big footprint on with students with disabilities. It gives grants to school districts specifically for IDA related costs. There have already been some contracts that have been canceled. And more importantly, not more importantly, but really importantly, this is the last place where the Office of Civil Rights helps families who have complaints about schools that are discriminating against students with disabilities. Its staff was cut by 50%. And about half the cases that office works on are disability cases. So that's a real example of a place we're concerned where there is now much less capacity to serve people who really need help and can't get it anywhere else. Social Security. Again, Congress isn't really making any changes to Social Security. These are all administrative changes, but they might have real big impacts for people who rely on those checks. The president and Congress have said, well, we're not going to change your benefit check amounts. However, they're cutting 7,000 staff, closing 6 agencies, and in March, they were planning to close a lot of local agencies. In addition to that, there have been some policy changes that would require people who could currently make changes over the telephone, which lots of people have access to not be able to do that anymore, but have to come in person. Well, that's a real challenge if you're a non-driver, and if your Social Security office is far away, and if there are fewer offices. There have been some executive orders that have also changed policy, and reports that things are not working as they did a few months ago. The other thing that has happened is that DOGE has been allowed access to the Social Security administration systems, and it has a very old information system, stable and reliable, which is good if you are trying to make sure that people don't miss their checks. Most tech people say like transitioning that system to something different would take a period of years, but DOGE thinks that they're going to do it in a matter of months, which really has several former Social Security Administration officials very, very nervous about whether that will lead to mistakes that could cause delays or wrong payments or other things with checks. So one thing that is happening, and I want to just emphasize that a lot of the things that are being reported, then sometimes the administration will come back and either say, well, that was never true, or they'll pull down a list that was publicly on a website, or they'll delay a policy that they had said was going to go into effect to make it go into effect later. I want you to see that for what it is. Every time that there's something that's being walked back or denied or postponed, it's the fingerprints of ordinary people who are calling their senators and saying, what is going on? This is not going to affect me really, really negatively. And we know that Social Security changes have been one of the things that senators have been hearing the most about. Again, another experiment. Lots of you have experience with Social Security. You can remember how long it took you to get through the disability determinants process. You can think about what would it mean if you'd had to wait longer, and what's your closest office, and all of these questions. This is a good way to kind of think about what these changes could mean for you and construct a story that will help illustrate for lawmakers what is the impact of, things that may seem little to the people who are making them, who are not reliant on Social Security. So what can we do? April is Medicaid Awareness Month, so there's lots of opportunities to keep talking about Medicaid and the value of Medicaid in people's lives. Congress is coming home. All right, make a visit with Congress. It's a great time to plan in drop-ins. Lots of you did this last time. I think they were in town last month, 1,000 years ago, who knows? It's a great time to continue that strategy of dropping by the office, dropping by the in-district office, and maybe you invite them to events now, or plan an invite-only community conversation. They're going to be home, and there's lots of things to talk about. And at the end of the month are our final 2 hearings for our state budget process. So again, 2 more touch points of things that you can go to and talk about Medicaid in particular. It's important to keep calling Congress, even if they're not responsive. Your federal lawmakers are the ones who really are the check and balance on what the administration is doing. So if you don't like some of the things that are some of the changes that are being made at federal agencies, Congress really does have something to say about it, because they're the ones who write the laws, and they're the ones who appropriated the money and said, yes, these programs should exist and should function, and we're paying for the staff, and we're paying for the money to come to the states to do those things. So if you're already calling, and many of you have been calling about Medicaid, you can add on concerns. Use that one call to talk about Medicaid and other programs you care about. Your concerns about Social Security, your concerns about disability programs, your concerns about, decision making and, not being thought through beforehand. All of those calls are really, really important, because it becomes harder and harder for offices to claim that nobody is paying attention. They know what people are calling about, and some folks really track that a lot and start publicly talking about how much they're hearing from different people about these different issues. Our national person thinks you should keep receipts. How many times have you asked for certain things? Like, keep a running log, keep receipts of, all the times you've asked for stuff. Keep receipts of the promises that lawmakers have made, if they've made any, because if they've said things like, hey, this won't impact people with disabilities, hold them to it, right? Remind them of that promise, because you're a savvy person who knows that some of these changes really do impact people with disabilities, either pretty immediately or in the long term. You can also keep encouraging your state lawmakers to be advocates for you behind the scenes. The way cuts get killed is behind closed doors, out of sight, out of mind. The way things change is because things in the back rooms are so uncomfortable that senators and congressmen are quietly saying to their leaders, like, don't make me vote on this. My constituents really hate this. Don't make me take a public position. We don't want this to happen because it's going to devastate my local economy. Those conversations have to become part of what's going on behind the scenes, and they have to get louder. And you can ask them to do that. Pressure from state officials can move members of Congress. Pressure from members of Congress can move congressional leadership. I'm going to close. There is no group of people who is more suited to this moment than people with intellectual developmental disabilities and their families. Also aging adults. We love our aging adult friends. But people with IDD have had to fight really hard for everything that they've had. They've had to fight for basic rights, basic right to live in the community, the right to be educated at all, or to some level, the expectation for accessibility. Can I get into a building or not? All of the laws that are on our books are the result of lots of people over time making strong advocacy arguments and then advocating for funding and then advocating for the programs and the people to push more. We are not in a perfect place. Like, we have a lot of things on the law that are in the books on the laws that many of us would say are not fully realized. 35 years after the ADA, and there are lots of buildings that don't have a wheelchair ramp, for example. There are lots of people who talk about not being treated the same, say, by their doctors as non-disabled folks. It isn't easy to be a non-driver. It isn't easy to need long-term care. You can't get what you need anywhere else. There's a lot of room for improvement. The work isn't done, but these cuts are a step backwards. They're not a step forwards. They do not solve any of the problems that you all know you would like to be better. So you're able to meet this moment in a way that a lot of people aren't, because you're used to having to do the fights and you're used to having to be persistent at the small and daily level about everything, but also at the bigger level. And a lot of other folks in this country have really not had to do that, and they've gotten used to something that's been stable for a long period of time, and now things aren't stable and they don't know how to react, but you do. You have had budget fights, you've had policy fights, you've had court fights, you've won lots of times over and over, okay? So I want you to remember that you're the ones, who have made Medicaid a national issue, and you've done it in under 6 weeks. And now lawmakers are following your lead. They should. You know what you're doing. And you know what needs to be done, and you know how to do this because you've done it before. So put yourself in the position of, you are the leaders at this point. You are the leaders of this moment, even though nobody thinks of this population necessarily as leaders. You are. You are the people who are showing them how it's done, and they've got to catch up. They've got a lot of catching up to do. So with that, I'm losing my voice. I don't know how Cory Bicker did 25 hours. It's amazing. We are now in the position where you have to keep doing all of the things, all of the time. And now there's a lot more to talk about. And as we move forward, now that reconciliation looks like it may move forward, we're going to continue these webinars at the same length and try and cover more things, because it is clear to us that this package of cuts is going to include Medicaid, but it may include many other things that are also really important to people's lives. And I got to 10:32, so I'm 2 minutes over. Are there any questions that people have?
Thanks, Cami. There's a couple of questions that are kind of lingering here. One is around what to do about other DD network organizations who may be impacted by changes at the ACL. Specifically, we keep getting a couple questions about what this might mean for Disability Rights Wisconsin and whether or not we should be able to advocate for them or with them or what they might need.
So